Now that we understand what audience analysis is, let's take a look at some of the reasons why we might conduct this type of audience analysis. First and foremost, we know that it's really important to always acknowledge the audience and to acknowledge their existence, because you are creating a relationship with your audience when you're giving a speech. So you have to do things like establish eye contact with your audience and thank them for coming, and really just let it be known how much you appreciate the fact that they came to your speech even when they didn't necessarily need to. And you can show this appreciation in a number of ways. One of these is by tailoring your speech to your specific audience. So one of the things that we can do is to choose a worthwhile topic. Your topic selection, the topic that you choose to speak about in your speech, should reflect your audience, right? You should always have your audience in mind when you are trying to come up with a topic. In addition, we conduct this audience analysis to make sure that our message is clear, to make sure that our audience is going to be able to understand our message and that they will get everything out of our topic that we want them to get. So we have to be careful not to use language that our audience isn't going to understand. For example, if we know that we're sitting in front of a bunch of liberal arts majors, we probably don't want to use a bunch of science lingo because they probably aren't going to understand it as readily. Or at the very least, you're going to have to do some work in defining those terms. So you have to make sure that you know what your audience does and doesn't know so that your topic that you've chosen specifically for them is the most clear and understandable message that you could possibly give. In addition, it's important to consider the audience when you are talking about controversial topics, because talking about controversial topics is an important task. But we have to be really careful in regards to our audience and what they believe and what they know about these different controversial topics. Now, it might seem like using controversial topics for our speeches seems like more of a persuasive topic, and you would be correct. But you can also talk about controversy in informative speeches. For example, if you provide both sides of the gun rights issue. For example, you could talk about how some people believe that we should have the ability to bear arms as was given to us by the Second Amendment, and that we should be able to have access to weapons to be able to protect ourselves. On the other hand, some people say that, well, the Second Amendment was written in the 1700s when we had single-load muskets that took 20 minutes to reload. So maybe we need to rethink some of our gun laws, right? So that's how you would do an informative speech about a controversial topic. But it's important to know what your audience believes on the subject of gun rights, for example, so that you know how to balance that information correctly. So we also need to adapt to our audience's needs. And so we have to be able to look at our audience and determine what their experience is in the world, what knowledge that they have, what values do they bring into the world. And our audience analysis can tell us that. And once we have that information, we'll be able to then adapt our speech to that knowledge that they already have, to the values that they brought into the room. And there's lots of different stuff to consider here. And we're going to talk in a moment about demographics and the way that different demographics that might exist in the room will affect the way that you talk about your topic. Because more often than not, you are going to be sitting, or rather standing, in front of a very diverse group of people. You'll be sitting in front of people of all different ages and genders and races and all sorts. And because of that, each of those people in that room has a different story to tell. So we have to consider those demographic and psychographic differences that might exist within the room. And with all of this, we have to make sure that we are avoiding offense whenever we are speaking in public. And this is why another reason why audience analysis is so important, because we have to know where our audience stands on certain topics and what they might find offending or not. And so we have to be aware of language and nonverbal behaviors that might send a negative message to our audience, and be able to not use that type of language, or not use language that's going to offend people. For example, there's lots of different labels that different groups use. You might call someone who is African American Black, for example, because they prefer that label over the other. And so we have to know like which labels we should use when describing people. Another example would be using the term undocumented person rather than illegal immigrant, because those two terms have very different connotations for a lot of people who might be sitting in front of you. So we just have to be sensitive to those folks and to their experiences and what language they might or might not like in order to avoid offending people in our audience. Because really, that's the last thing we want to do, right? We want to avoid turning our audience away from our message, because our ultimate goal as public speakers is to have our audience hear our message. And if we start off the bat by offending them, we're not going to reach that goal. So conducting an audience analysis is a really crucial part of the speech making process.